Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network. I'm Sher Ali Khan. Today I'm speaking with Christopher Moffat, a political and intellectual historian of modern South Asia, whose work focuses on how the past is remembered, contested, and made to matter in the present. Drawing on both archival and ethnographic methods, we're discussing India's revolutionary inheritance, his book on Bhagat Singh, the anti-colonial revolutionary executed by the British in 1931, where he is approached not as a figure of the past, but through how his life and death continue to circulate, with execution intensifying rather than ending his political force. If you find these conversations interesting, like, share, and subscribe, and support the work at buymeacoffee.com/organic filaments network. Welcome to the show, Chris. It's been quite a long time.
Thanks, Sherry. Yeah, it's great to be here, and to reconnect for your viewers. Cher and I know each other from a long time back in Lahore, and I'm really excited to continue our conversations.
So I want to begin by discussing uh, how you displace the question of who Bhagat Singh was with inheritance as something that returns as a demand on the present rather than sitting behind it. Why was it necessary to step away from recovery and approach him in this way?
Yeah, thanks. So Bhagat Singh is this ubiquitous figure, especially in contemporary India, where he is one of the sort of iconic anti-colonial figures who is celebrated, as I note in the book, kind of across the political spectrum. A lot of the historical work that has been done around Bhagat Singh has been in this mode of recovery. And this is really important work. It faces a lot of obstacles in the sense that Bhagat Singh was executed when he was 23 years old. He did not leave a huge body of work to be recovered, as it were. And he also operated as a revolutionary, right? He was a part of a clandestine movement that was characterized by secrecy. Did not leave for those reasons a lot of paper records, etc. Right? He's not this big public figure who's publishing editorials every weekend in the newspaper. So the project of recovery already faced some obstacles. There has been a huge amount of important work done by scholars in India, people like Chaman Lal, Jagmohan Singh, really activist-oriented scholars who have tried to put together and disseminate Bhagat Singh's writings, which are really insightful. But the starting point for my project was to do something a little bit different and to ask why it is this figure who is a revolutionary, an admirer of Lenin, of Marx, who is part of a kind of uh, movement that is calling for the abolition of exploitation, for a kind of true freedom, not only from the British, but from kind of capitalism. Why does he become this figure who is able to be invoked by Hindu nationalists or by Sikh secessionists or by environmentalists or the Indian Army, any sort of constituency? It's kind of hard to um, overemphasize his ubiquity across as a popular figure. So my research was about asking why this was the case and to say what it can tell us about, I guess, leftist engagement with history and history as a site of struggle, and how we think about the role of violence and especially martyrdom or self-sacrifice as as a kind of source for political potentiality.
And in your approach to Bhagat Singh's writings, you sort of stay with the lost, dispersal, and disputed authorship than trying to assemble a stable corpus. What becomes visible when the archive is approached in this way?
So, as in, what becomes visible in terms of for the historian? Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah, in your approach, I guess you could say.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so a lot of the book, India's Revolutionary Inheritance, it came out of my PhD. There is a sort of intervention being made about how histories are written. I think there's a kind of urge to think critically about how we can think about popular memory, popular commemoration, and to think about the sort of spectral ways in which revolutionary figures become effective or meaningful. And so my departure from focusing purely on his writing is an attempt to think critically about how history is made and how we might think about spectrality as historians. And this requires maybe a little bit of explanation. Historians, the first section of my book is called Against Archaeology, right? And it's this provocation around the way that we try and go back and dig through the soil and try and excavate history as it was in a sort of coherent way, in a stable way. And I was trying to think differently about what happens when that history is not so stable and still. What happens if that history is still moving, it still has an effect beyond a kind of fabled origin point. And Bhagat Singh became a really useful case study for this, precisely for the reasons that I mentioned. He was already this sort of spectral figure in his life, in the sense that he was part of a secret movement, appearing in these kind of violent actions and then disappearing again. So he already is shaped by mythologization and sort of kind of romance around him, right? And then this is only, as you alluded to, Cher, in your opening comments, this is only like escalated when he is hanged by the British colonial state. So he is seen as greeting this fate with happiness, with a kind of he thanks the judge who sentences him to death for the opportunity to prove his commitment to his cause, right? Which is revolution. And so rather than relying purely on a sort of textual archive, I became interested in asking what historians can learn from ethnographic methods of research, and ethnographies of past making and of historicity, the kind of way that people make relations between the past, present, and future. So how someone might say Bhagat Singh is not a figure of the past, but actually someone who is a comrade who continues to inform our struggles, right? Who we are still accountable to. And that required a different sort of approach to his effects as a figure, rather than simply this essay he wrote in 1926 or this pamphlet he published in 1931. I'm not saying that those texts are not important, and clearly he was making ideological statements in those. And I have gotten kind of flack from critics about too easily dismissing those. But it's not a kind of either or for me. It's a sort of both and also. It's kind of understanding that these are part of Bhagat Singh's assertions in his kind of interventions into politics. But so are his kind of, as I argue in the book, his ways of being in relation to power, his sort of defiance, his performance of courage, his performance of masculinity, which is also a really important part of his widespread appeal, right? And we can maybe talk about that sort of thing later.
Yeah. And in terms of the execution, one of the claims in the book is that Bhagat Singh's political life is actually intensified by it. Its circulation expands at the point of death. How does your approach to death shift the way Bhagat Singh is understood in a sense?
So maybe it's worth saying a little bit about Bhagat Singh's context for your viewers, if you think that'd be useful, Share.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
Bhagat Singh he's born in 1907. He comes of age in the period of like the kind of first mass movement against the British rule in India, led by Gandhi, which is inaugurated in 1920, the first non-cooperation movement. And he's part of a wave of youth disaffection after the collapse of that movement in 1922. We know that Gandhi canceled that movement because some of his followers burned a police thana in Chauri Chaura, right? And Gandhi said, no violence, you're not ready for independence. And a lot of revolutionary groups who had put their actions on hold to allow for Gandhi's experiments were frustrated. They thought this should have been escalated into a mass revolution. And Bhagat Singh is part of that strain. He's very much inspired by Lenin and what has happened in Russia in 1917. These are events that are being carefully recorded by a flourishing dissident press in places like Lahore and elsewhere. So he's very in tune with them. And part of the task of revolutionary groups in the 1920s and the youth movements, which Bhagat Singh kind of comes into politics alongside, is to sort of stir a sense of urgency into the masses, to get them to recognize we have this capability of a mass movement. The time is now to act, and we cannot, just wait for Gandhi to tell us when to went to rebel. Right? So there is a very strong aspect of incitement in Bhagat Singh's politics, this sort of sense that we just need to allow the masses to see that the revolution, the time is ripe for revolution. Revolution is possible. We have the power to kind of rise up against the British to achieve a kind of independence, but also revolution, social revolution, economic revolution. And so a lot of the actions that they're engaged with are trying to stir senses of complacency, senses of, they speak a lot about the slumbering masses who need to be woken up, right? And this comes then to the execution. So Bhagat Singh assassinates a police officer in Lahore in 1929, part as a kind of revenge for beating up a prominent nationalist politician, Lajpat Rai. In 1910, in April, Bhagat Singh and one of his comrades, Badukeshwar Dutt, throw a bomb into the Legislative Assembly in New Delhi. It's a smoke bomb. It doesn't kill anyone. I think one person is injured, but it's basically a kind of propaganda exercise. They throw pamphlets into the assembly that say it takes a loud voice to make the deaf hear. And they're citing a French anarchist, Auguste Vaillant, who did the kind of same thing as a repetition of a historical protest from Paris in 1890s. And Bhagat Singh and Dutt hand themselves in. They are to the police. They plan to use the courtroom as a platform for them to spread their revolutionary propaganda. And during the trial, which, they do use the court as a platform to spread their revolutionary propaganda to, again, cast doubt on the British state and its claim to represent justice. But because they're associated with the assassination of this police officer, they are charged with conspiring to wage war against the King Emperor, and that is why Bhagat Singh is executed. He's executed alongside two other revolutionaries, Sukhdev Thapar and Shivaram Rajguru, who are also part of his revolutionary organization, the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association. So kind of describing this in a kind of very abbreviated way. But it's all just to say that the hanging, Bhagat Singh thanking the judge for giving him this opportunity to prove his commitment to revolution, is also part of this idea that such a spectacle will stir the slumbering masses. And there are reports. I originally thought this was kind of like part of the myth or legend that Bhagat Singh went to the gallows shouting "Inqilab Zindabad," right? Long live revolution. But there are actually news reports from the time that from outside the prison walls, they heard shouts of "Inqilab Zindabad" at the hang, right? So there is this very real sense that death was faced bravely. There was a sense that this would be a contagion, right? That people would be so infuriated. They would be so infuriated, but also inspired by these young men giving their lives for revolution, for freedom, that they would rise up, right? And so one of the things that I talk about in the book, and Cher, please come in if I'm rambling a bit too much, but is this way that martyrdom, Bhagat Singh is remembered as Shahid-e-Azam, right? The great martyr. He is kind of seen as a martyr figure. Martyrdom in the Christian tradition is often seen with the kind of as part of the founding of a community, the community of the church, and etc. Right? There is also martyrdom to protect an existing community, which we know from wars of liberation, in a kind of a nationalist register. But I think what Bhagat Singh is doing is martyrdom to kind of incite a community or shake a community, right? It's to actually throw into relief the urgency of politics, the urgency of action. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk about in the book is that Bhagat Singh is not, he has this kind of non-foundational potential. His potential is anarchic. And I know you want to talk about that as well, Cher, in that it is about comportment in relation to power, a certain relation in a relationship to power. And I think his martyrdom is about consolidating a sort of anarchic potential or a non-foundational potential. And yeah, maybe we can say more about that in a bit.
Yeah. You also write that Bhagat Singh does not simply rest, but his afterlife remains unsettled and in motion. What kind of political time is being described here?
So one of the things that I think Bhagat Singh helps us to do, as from my position as a historian of modern India, South Asia, but also as people who are interested in activism in these places, is to question and really throw into relief the effectiveness of 1947 as a kind of historical event, right? As the independence of India and Pakistan as being, the end of one historical sequence and the beginning of another, which is typically how it's treated, right? The end of a freedom movement, the beginning of independence, right? And one of the arguments I make in the book is that Bhagat Singh's enduring potential, his enduring appeal in the decades after independence, and indeed right up to the 21st century when he continues to be very popular, is about the sort of unfinished business of anti-colonial revolution. This idea that all of the problems that Bhagat Singh and his comrades were organizing against, they were not necessarily resolved with independence in 1947. And in fact, a lot of the caste and class gender hierarchies that are criticized in their work enduring or take new forms, right? Bhagat Singh very much associated with this argument that we don't want just English capitalists replaced by Indian capitalists, right? Or the kind of Communist Party slogan, "Ye azadi jhuti hai," this freedom is a lie. We still, need to kind of continue fighting for social and political revolution. This was just a transfer of power that happened in 1947. And so that differentiates for me Bhagat Singh from people who are more tied up in that foundational story. So a figure like Gandhi, who was also not happy with, partition and the nature of independence, but is still associated very closely with the formation of a nation state. Even Ambedkar, right, who has also a really interesting afterlife and is absolutely part of this kind of unfinished business, but still has an association with the state through authoring the Constitution, through the kind of so Bhagat Singh his potentiality is kind of preserved by the nature of his death, right? The kind of fact of his youth, the fact that he is not kind of, part of it is related to this fact that he doesn't have this corpus for recovery, right? So I talk about in the book a lot about unfinished business, which is a term that it's a kind of wider term, but I take it from Avery Gordon's work on haunting and this notion that, sometimes things that we think have ended or in the past are not actually over, right? They're still with us in different ways. So Bhagat Singh died in 1931, or he was executed in 1931. He's a figure from a particular historical moment, but actually he's still very effective today. And we need to ask why that is and for what reasons, and what that tells us about not only Bhagat Singh as a figure, but also about the Indian state, or even as I try and approach at the end of the book in Pakistan, the Pakistani state.
Yeah. And when you turn to Lahore, the city appears through sort of circulation, associations, and reading where Bhagat Singh is formed through these movements rather than located in a fixed place. What does it mean to think Lahore in motion in this way? Or what is lost if the city is treated as a fixed setting?
Yeah, I think so. Lahore opens the book and closes the book, right? Lahore is the city where Bhagat Singh, who grew up outside Lialpur, which is today's Faisalabad, in a kind of rural area, comes as a student to Lahore. And one of the things that I wanted to communicate was Lahore as a place full of dissent, I guess, or networks for dissent or prompts towards dissent. And I guess that's the emphasis on motion, then on people passing through, on ideas passing through, books being smuggled, all of these sorts of things that Bhagat Singh is exposed to, which is a sort of critique of a literature on the colonial city, which is very focused on segregated spaces or the consolidation of a kind of middle class segment of society that has a control over the press and educational sectors. And that's kind of a lot of really important work on Bhagat Singh on Lahore has focused on those things. But I was trying to show a different sort of way of navigating the city through these sort of dissident libraries and maybe even like coffee houses and this kind of thing, right? The other end of the spectrum is in 21st century Lahore, which is separated from its history by partition, right? In the sense that in 1947, Lahore becomes part of Pakistan. Bhagat Singh is not part of the Pakistan national narrative. This is in part because he's seen as an Indian patriot. And this is one of the sort of ways in which his legacy is incorporated by the Indian nation state, that he wasn't necessarily a revolutionary, but he was a brave Indian patriot, right, who gave his head to Mother India, to the mother goddess, right? So he's kind of very much associated with a sort of Indian national tradition. And for that reason isn't commemorated in Pakistan. But also, we know that the Pakistani state is not particularly keen on celebrating Marxist revolutionaries anyway, right? So, or people who declare themselves to be atheists. And that has been also another sticking point in how Bhagat Singh is commemorated in Lahore. But one of the things that I was interested in exploring in terms of how Bhagat Singh continues to be a sort of disruptive force is by looking at the way that student groups, student activist groups, I took a lot about leftist kind of street theater groups, animate Bhagat Singh in public spaces in Lahore, demanding that the spot where he was hanged, the former site of the Lahore Central Jail, is renamed. It's a kind of traffic intersection, a chowk, Shadman Chowk, is named after him. That is, I mean, Sher, you could like kind of share some of your sense on these politics, because I know you've kind of experienced them on a ground level as well. But I think like in relation to Lahore in Motion, part of the kind of appeal here is that it's questioning again this distinction that's drawn in 1947 between India and Pakistan at points. Often it's through Punjabi language politics, where there's trying to point to a shared heritage, a shared political heritage, but also cultural heritage between India and Pakistan. And also just in a sense to, animate this sort of repressed history of revolution in Lahore. I don't know, Cher, what you think about that kind of?
Well, I mean, for me, I think it's interesting because you recently edited a volume on Lahore in Motion, and the way the city is sort of uh, approached through movement, circulation, and just everyday trajectories uh, is a unique way to approach the city, especially when we're thinking about sort of wayward practices or fugitive practices and those things. And I think there is something to say about how Bhagat Singh sort of relates to organizing in Lahore, especially the street theater, and how that site becomes like this contested site. It's also the site of several other events that took place in that area in terms of the assassination, which led to uh, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the Pakistani leader, being executed as well for a murder that took place there. So it's a unique site in that sense. But I think what is interesting is how you're bringing, looking at it at the city as like a lived entity,
Yeah.
in a sense.
Yeah, I am. So Bhagat Singh was kind of the start of a long relationship I've had with Lahore, I guess. And so this more recent work, which you mentioned on Lahore in Motion, is again an attempt. It's an edited volume, as you know, and we had 26 different contributors talking about different parts of the city, connected through a new metro line. And I guess the one of the guiding ideas was thinking with Anna Singh's work about friction, and to look at how this kind of desire for smooth continuities across urban space in this case, for the flow of people, the flow of goods, which is represented by the metro, are actually generating different sort of frictions in the built environments, and the way that we try to do that. So thinking about motion, but not also stoppages and obstacles, and how the urban life is navigated around those, I guess. And yeah, I mean, that also relates to the Bhagat Singh work in terms of how history is not, again, proceeding in linear time. It's shaped by struggle. It's shaped by silences. It's shaped by conjurings and evocations in the present.
Yeah, and one thing I want to look at is how you foreground practices such as collective reading, discussions, and various other forms of association, but refraining from like placing them within ideology. What is the kind of political formation that appears through your observations of these practices?
In relation to what, share to the kind of like the
Yeah,
things sort of conjurings, is that what you mean?
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it's difficult. So, and it's a whole kind of spectrum of things, I guess. Maybe one way to frame it is that I looked at two sort of possible responses to Bhagat Singh's call to responsibility. This is kind of how I think about that call of Inqilab Zindabad from the gallows. Long live revolution. May revolution continue. You should honor me by continuing my revolution, this revolution. This is a demand that Bhagat Singh places on his inheritors, those who come after, right? And this is not straightforward in terms of politics. There is an argument that Faisal Devji makes in his writing on kind of martyrdom and self-sacrifice that one of the paradoxes of self-sacrifice is that it foregrounds the body or the individual, right? The kind of like dying body, the suffering body, rather than necessarily the idea or the program behind the martyrs sacrifice. And so this is really the case with Bhagat Singh. As I said, there's a lot of ways in which his revolution is received as being actually in service of the nation state, or as a brave patriot, or in service of a certain sort of religious idea of sacrifice. But one of the things that I feel is consistent is that his demand is, I struggle to say this in a way that doesn't sound kind of academically pretentious, but the demand is vertiginous, right? There is a vertigo associated with the call to responsibility in the sense that it's destabilizing, right? You can feel the purpose is to make you feel that you should be doing more, that you are complacent, you must resist complacency, you must stand up for what you believe in, you must never back down, right? And that's, for most people, that is like a difficult demand to take on, right? And it is very much associated with youth in Bhagat Singh's case, and I talk about that in the book as well. To get back to your question about politics, there are two ways, I think, to navigate this vertiginous demand. And one of them is to basically try and contain it, right? To say Bhagat Singh is a figure of the past. He fought for the freedom of India, which has now been achieved. And so we can celebrate him as a figure of the past through building statues to him, kind of saluting him, recognizing him as part of our anti-colonial history, and so on, right? The other way to honor Bhagat Singh or to kind of accept his demand is to continue his struggle, right? And so one of the ways that you can honor Bhagat Singh is to be politically active. And this is where the dispute comes around. Is it politically active in a sort of clandestine revolutionary movement? Is it through a kind of parliamentary party? Is it through a masculinist bodybuilding kind of Hindutva vigilante group, which, in my research I talked about as also being very attached to Bhagat Singh as this kind of muscular figure of vengeance and honor, right? And I say that actually, I make an argument at the end that the most difficult parts of Bhagat Singh's legacy, the most like the jagged edges, as I put it, the most kind of promising are those which are about a kind of economic and social revolution in the sort of tradition that he's drawing from Marx and Lenin and others like that, right? And so the long way of answering your question, Cher, is that there is no set politics to this kind of like notion of inheritance through a kind of struggle over Bhagat Singh's, what do I want to say? Sorry, I'm kind of stumbling on my words here. Through a kind of inheritance is something to be struggled over, right? And to assert the most kind of living part of his legacy, which we can argue is the most challenging part of his legacy, is this question of social and political revolution.
Yeah. And another key thing I see in the book is your emphasis on rupture, leaving home or breaking obligations or reorganizing life trajectories. How do these acts of departure reconfigure Bhagat Singh's relation to the world he comes from?
Yeah, so the book is in two parts, right? The first part is about Bhagat Singh as a kind of historical figure. The second part is about these sort of afterlives in contemporary India and Pakistan. And I think what you're referring to is this way in which I approach his early years as, trying to kind of think about how transgression becomes associated with politics for him, right? And meaningful politics. So, yeah, I mean, I think the the kind of way in which Bhagat Singh is often talked about by historians is trying to place him in a lineage with his grandfather, who was a kind of political activist. His father also, involved in sort of different anti-colonial movements. His uncle Ajit Singh was kind of part of the Ghadar movement, which is this sort of transnational rebellion against the British in the context of the First World War. It started on the west coast of America and Canada with Sikh migrants there. So a lot of the work has Bhagat Singh, it speaks very romantically about revolution being in his blood, right? As if it's something that is literally biologically inherited. And I sort of push back against some of that to show how Bhagat Singh's youth was shaped in many ways by his rejection of an inheritance, as you said, Rashera, a kind of rupture from a certain sort of tradition or expectations, and the way he kind of, leaves home to be educated. He kind of runs away when he's supposed to be married, saying that he will take his bride, or the nation as his bride, or something like this. Another romantic rendition of the story. So I think this is all part of that articulation of a revolutionary subject that is not bound by obligations to family, to tradition, to these sorts of things. That is someone who is a kind of political worker who is prepared to sacrifice, and who, in the articulation of a lot of the youth groups that Bhagat Singh is associated with, such as the Naujawan Bharat Sabha, is, something that distinguishes, this is the promise of the youth, right? This is why youth workers in revolutionary struggles and in national struggles have a particular contribution to make, because they do not have those obligations, whether to work or to family or to kind of paying, rent or whatever it might be, right? I mean, I guess students are still paying rent, but it may be in a different sort of register. So yeah, I think I'm kind of stumbling around your question, Cher, but is that kind of what you? I think it's about
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
worker who is unbound.
Absolutely. And what I found interesting in that was, I, am I right to say that Bhagat Singh read across Marxist and anarchist texts? And one of your arguments would be that he's not situated in one camp or another in that sense. He's reading across different texts and those things.
Yeah, I mean, again, I try and avoid making a kind of argument about what sort of thinker Bhagat Singh was, precisely because he was kind of like in motion, I guess, right? He was reading quite a lot. He obviously, he writes in this "Why I Am an Atheist" essay in 1931, which is published kind of posthumously. It's a kind of biographical account, and he he does kind of explain where he arrives in terms of a kind of the need for an organized mass movement in a Marxist tradition, but he describes his earlier ideation as really a kind of in progress, narrative. And this is shaped by the fact that he's reading books in libraries that are formed of quite wide ranging collections. So there was a library called the Dwarkadas Library in Lahore, which was associated with the Tilak School of Politics, which was a kind of national college set up in the 90s on the model of some of these kind of working class education institutes in the United States. And that's a kind of story story of connection that I unpick in the book. And a lot of the books there come from the personal collection of Lajpat Rai, this nationalist leader who lived in New York and traveled the world and kind of assembled all of these from, like, whether they're Fabian socialists from the UK to like anarchist activists in the US. And so he is reading, Sidney and Beatrice Webb alongside Prince Kropotkin and these kind of figures, right? So there is a voraciousness to Bhagat Singh's intellectual appetite that is seen in some of his writings, but also famously in this jail notebook, which he was kind of smuggled out of prison. And it's just, I mean, it is just a notebook. It's his notes on different things he's reading. People are giving him books. He was in prison for about 2 years before he's executed. So this is a relatively long period. People are bringing in books from the Dwarkadas Library. To him, we have letters that he's written to friends asking for specific books. He's reading a kind of compendium by Upton Sinclair on social justice thought. The Cry for Justice is the name of the volume. And so he's encountering a huge range of figures. I think one of the interesting things about Bhagat Singh is very much claimed today by communist parties in India. The early communist parties in the 1920s are actually, it's a complicated story because Bhagat Singh and his comrades are in prison at the same time as the Meerut conspiracy case is taking place. And this is kind of a sort of crackdown on early communist organization in India. And there's a lot of solidarity between these different conspiracy cases. There are also some communist writers dismissing Bhagat Singh and his group as being part of a kind of juvenile stage of politics where they are pursuing assassinations and bombings, and that this is a kind of politics of the spectacle rather than of organized mass movement, right? And I think that this is also like something that Bhagat Singh is contesting in different ways. So yeah, I think you're right, Shared, to point out the kind of capaciousness in his politics, and a reminder that this is, he is 23 years old, right? This is something that this is a kind of intellectual trajectory that's very much in motion. And a lot of histories written about him actually speculate on where he will arrive, right? And that's something I write about in the book too. This kind of idea that Bhagat Singh, had he lived, he would have eventually been a member of the Communist Party, or he would have eventually joined the Indian National Congress, or something like that. People make arguments about his future based on a reading of the kind of limited sources that we have. I should say that a lot of his comrades who were part of the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association do go on to be members of the Communist Party of India. Ajay Ghosh, in particular, I think ends up being secretary of the CPI at some point.
Yeah. I want to speak a bit about the hunger strike and death of Jatindra Nath Das. I
Mm,
totally butchered the name. And how you bring the body into politics as, a site of exposure and endurance. So what is the claim being made through the body here?
sure. So as I just indicated, Bhagat Singh is in prison for a number of years. A lot of the revolutionary organization is rounded up after the Legislative Assembly bombing. The British, of course, have spies everywhere. There are a lot of people that revolutionaries that actually turn approvers. Not a lot, but there are a substantial number who turn approvers, which is the name for someone who basically makes a plea bargain and turns over their comrades for a lighter sentence, right? Um, so there's a huge amount of revolutionaries who are brought into prison, and there is a kind of decision amongst them. So they can actually, when they're brought, they're imprisoned in different places, but when they're brought to the courtroom, they can kind of convene in different ways, right?
Yeah.
And actually, a lot of the recordings of the courtroom talk about how the accused and the doc are just like ignoring the proceedings and just talking to each other, right? They've already decided that they're not going to contest the charges in a real way. So the courtroom becomes this space for performance of another, as I write in the book, a kind of another idea of justice, and another world is kind of performed theatrically in the court case, right? The hunger strike is part of this performance. Initially, it's a claim that the revolutionaries should be treated as political prisoners, this kind of newer category of political prisoner, as opposed to being treated as common criminals, which is kind of how they had been, how the conditions of the jail were organized around them. Talked about how the charges that are brought against them are conspiracy to wage war against the emperor. This is a political charge. They should be treated as political prisoners, and as such be given, you know, things like the right to newspapers, the right to writing instruments, the kind of different sort of foods, or what's the word, like kind of reprieve from prison labor, these kind of things, right? So it's a kind of performance. It's a sort of argument that we're not criminals. This is a political case. So that's where the hunger strike begins, and as you say, Cher, it becomes this sort of really bodily spectacle, right? Wherein the accused become very physically frail. They are at certain points into the hunger strike being kind of wheeled into the courtroom on kind of stretchers and things. There's force feeding, there's fights around force feeding. There are, interestingly, the nationalist newspapers are actually chronicling the health of the revolutionaries in daily newspapers. So because doctors are being brought into the prison to check on their health, information is getting out as well of the prison. So it's not such a kind of secret place where the British can do what they will. There's kind of certain obligations they have. So it is very visible, in spite of the fact that it's behind prison walls. It's very visible what is taking place here. And the most dramatic event comes when Jatindra Nath Das, who was recruited to the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association as a bomb maker. He's originally from Calcutta. Uh, he dies as part of the hunger strike, and there is like a parade of his body from the jails in Lahore all the way across the country to Calcutta. The kind of train stops in different places, and he's kind of his body is, I guess, people pay their tributes to this dead young man. So a lot of the work that has been written about this moment has been that, like, this is where Bhagat Singh becomes a national figure, and it's because he adopts a sort of Gandhian, strategy, right? And I kind of disagree with this take a little bit, because I mean, clearly it has an effect on their popular appeal, but I think it's less about this. It's more about how it contributes to an overall sense of courage and resistance to a refusal to broken justice, right? And the visual imagery that continues around Bhagat Singh is still very muscular. He's still this kind of swaggering, handsome figure with a mustache that he's kind of twirling. He's not an emaciated, broken figure. This is not part of his aesthetic appeal. And Jatindra Nath Das, who arguably gives the most in this sacrifice, is not really a popular, iconic figure in the way that Bhagat Singh is, right? So I think while the hunger strike is obviously a very important part of this historical moment, in terms of the body, I think the capacity to suffer and the capacity to sacrifice oneself again for a cause is more important than the kind of like emaciated suffering body, right? It's more about the capacity to endure, which is also part of a kind of in Bhagat Singh's case at least, a sort of masculinity or a muscular kind of endurance that is really important, I think, to his wider popular appeal.
So yeah, last couple of questions. I want to quickly go through something I saw in the monuments chapter and how you look at the question of commemoration and the way you draw on Walter Benjamin to distinguish the difference between celebrating the past and saving it in terms of Bhagat Singh. Could you give a few comments about that?
Yeah, yeah. So as I said, the book takes as a kind of opening problem this fact of Bhagat Singh's ubiquity in India, right? This fact that he is everywhere. There's films made about him. There's posters. You see him on T-shirts and bumper stickers and all of these things, right? And one of the things that we see a lot of are statues to Bhagat Singh, right? Statues in very prominent places. There are statues in parks, and there's a statue outside the Legislative Assembly building that he bombed in 1929. It's now the Lok Sabha, of course, of the kind of the Republic of India. But there's a kind of massive statue of him out there. There are statues in village roundabouts. There's a kind of massive monumental landscape around this figure. And one of the things that I say in the book is that this isn't necessarily a indication that Bhagat Singh that his revolutionary demand is being taken seriously, right? I talk about the statue less as a kind of object that, asserts Bhagat Singh as this kind of disruptive figure in public space, as actually a way to contain Bhagat Singh, as a way to kind of like take the ghost, this kind of spectral figure, and consolidate him into a tomb, the tomb being the statue. He's kind of captured there. You can kind of go out on your day to your office job. You see the Bhagat Singh statue, you salute it, you carry on your day as usual, right? So one of the things that I would try to do in that chapter is to say, like, usually we think about monuments as having this sort of disruptive effect, or, especially in the context, and I wrote this all before the kind of Rhodes Must Fall, global sort of iconoclasms around statues, in which statues are given a sort of agency. But actually, I was informed by a sort of earlier literature that says, statues are like mostly invisible. Statues, we just kind of like integrate them into our the background of a place, right? They're animated, of course, on 23rd of March, Bhagat Singh's death anniversary. People will have a rally around the statue. They'll put some flowers over his neck, but other than that, it's not necessarily politically meaningful. So that is kind of one of the things that I'm trying to open up in that chapter. And I bring up Walter Benjamin's work. Again, this contrast, as you say, between celebrating the past as something that is stable, behind us, behind the present, something that's happened that we can celebrate or honor, versus saving the past, which recognizes that the past is a site of struggle, that the past is always under threat, or at least the kind of ways that we seek to defend its potentiality or its, potential disruptiveness is always trying to be smoothed over or incorporated by power, by the state, by order, especially in Bhagat Singh's case, right? It's much easier to see him as a brave patriot who died for India rather than a kind of Marxist revolutionary who, sought to reformulate or kind of, overturn social order, right? So this idea of like, is it more of a tribute to Bhagat Singh to build a statue to him or to like continue his revolutionary struggle? Is that kind of difference between celebrating and saving? As Benjamin writes, I can't remember the actual quote, even though I've said it about 1,000 times in my life. That's kind of like that. The dead are not safe from the power in the present, right? Like the kind of in an era of fascism, which was Benjamin's period and is also kind of arguably our own. Even the dead will not be safe. That's it. Even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins, right?
Yeah. And I want to wrap up by asking you two questions. When you look at South Asia now, where do you think Bhagat Singh's force is most politically alive? And what are you working on now? And how are these concerns sort of carrying into your next project?
Hmm. Yeah, so I think so this book came out in 2019 and I I am aware I did most of the research in 2010 to 2012. So it was quite a while ago now and I am very aware that I wrote the book in a period before Narendra Modi came to power, in a time where that sort of thing still seemed a little bit yeah, I mean, it seemed very unlikely in 2011, 2012, right? And it was also at a very different kind of political place in terms of, yeah, I don't know, the kind of political scene in the UK where I was writing the work, outside of being in India. I did my PhD in the UK, and it was the time of the kind of like student movement against university tuition fees coming into effect. It was the time of the Occupy movement, a very different sort of political circumstance that then was even, 5, 6 years later when the book came out in 2019, right? When we have Modi and we had Trump and we had all of this kind of very different sort of politics. So I finished the book, and maybe I still kind of um, sort of abide by this, and a lot of comrades in India didn't like the fact necessarily that I said that Bhagat Singh is more powerful in Lahore precisely because he is more repressed there, right? He hasn't been smoothed out in this iconic way that he had in India, where people like Narendra Modi are going to his samadhi in Husainawala in Punjab to like pay tributes on his death anniversary, right? Where there isn't this kind of like consensus that has been built around Bhagat Singh as this national figure that is very difficult to disrupt sometimes, right? Not to say that it can't be disrupted, but it is. There is a kind of like there's a difficulty to it. Whereas in Pakistan, it's more confrontational. I think the point about Bhagat Singh's potentiality for me is that it is a potentiality of confrontation. It's about a dispute. It's about inaugurating a political dispute, and the edges for doing so in Pakistan are very jagged. Right, he is not part of a national narrative. 23rd of March, the death anniversary is on a national holiday in Pakistan, right? And there's a lot of kind of contradictions that are made apparent through a figure like Bhagat Singh being celebrated in Pakistan. So, I'm a little kind of concerned about the sort of the way that I've kind of, at least in the last few years, how Bhagat Singh has been the fate of Bhagat Singh in Modi's India, I guess. And this is something that I need to really reflect a little more on.
Yeah. And what are you working on now? And how are these concerns carrying out into your next projects?
Yeah, so I have a new book coming out in June, which is actually on Lahore and is a very different sort of study on architecture in Lahore after independence, in focusing mainly on the 60s and 70s. But one of the kind of continuities is that I'm interested in how, again, the kind of organizing concept of my work is around how historicity and how people make sense of that relationship between past, present, and future. And with Bhagat Singh, I was able to do that, to say, like, how do people make sense of the relationship between history, anti-colonial histories, and the post-colonial present through a figure like Bhagat Singh. But with this architecture work, it's about how people make sense about the relationship between the past and about like heritage architecture, um, and the present through buildings and the built environment. Right.
Yeah.
So it is a little more engaged, less in the kind of like the spectral than, in directly the material. But it's been also shaped by my interest in, archival research alongside ethnographic work. And I've learned a lot about the city and also this kind of connections between Lahore and other urban environments in South Asia and internationally. So yeah, I mean, there's still kind of continuity in terms of themes, even if it's not as kind of politically, provocative, I guess, as the Bhagat Singh work maybe was or tried to be.
Thank you for appearing on the Organic Filament Network, Chris. I hope we can have you on again when your next book comes out.
Thanks, Cher. Really honored to be here.
Okay, thank you. That was our conversation with Christopher Moffat. If you found this meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the work, you can visit buymeacoffee.com/organic filaments network. Thank you. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.